This is the brand new Panasonic Lumix S9. It's an impressively compact, full-frame mirrorless that's essentially a smaller sibling to the Panasonic S5 II. Panasonic has designed this camera for content creators, so there are some features here that cater more to mobile content creation that, in addition to the much smaller size, separate it somewhat from the S5 II. Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at the brand new Lumix S9. Panasonic graciously invited me to come to Japan last week for their Lumix Global Summit, where they unveiled not only the S9, but two compact lenses that are going to go with this camera. This is a really interesting direction that Panasonic has gone in with this. I want to talk about that and some of my impressions having used this camera for a week now in this video. So first of all, let's dive down and see what we've got here. So the first thing that you're going to notice about the S9 is that it is extremely compact. In fact, it's actually a bit smaller than the Fujifilm X100VI, and unlike the Fujifilm, it features a full-frame sensor, you can change the lenses, and it features a very unique interface for choosing LUTs, much like what Fujifilm does with its film simulations. So a LUT is a color lookup table, and LUTs can be downloaded, they can be managed, created, and even combined using the new Lumix Lab app for both iPhone and Android devices. Eventually, the Lumix Lab app will replace the current Lumix Sync. The S9 also features wireless transfer at 5 GHz for quickly moving data to and from the camera. So I want to break down the S9 and look at this from 3 different angles. So first of all, we're going to look at it as a stills camera, we're going to look at it as a video camera, and then we're going to look at what it does in terms of content creation. But first, let's talk about stills. So as a stills camera, you get the same 24 megapixel sensor that we have in the Panasonic S5 II. We also have the same phase detection, autofocus, image stabilization, all the things that make that a pretty awesome stills camera if you're fine with 24 megapixels. I love the S5 II, it's one of my favorite cameras. This is a little bit different. This is a small scaled down version, and so because of the size, because of the weight, they have made some concessions to scale back a few things, unfortunately. The first big one is there is no mechanical shutter. This is electronic shutter only. Second, you're going to notice there is no electronic viewfinder. This is only usable with the back screen monitor. And then finally, there is no flash connection. So essentially we have a cold shoe on the top of the camera, which works really well if you're attaching a microphone receiver or something like that if you're shooting video. Unfortunately for stills, there is no way of shooting flash with this camera. Now, having said that, and we'll discuss this a little more in depth when I get to some of my opinions on this, the image quality from this camera is fantastic for stills. And at first, I'll be honest, it was very frustrating to find that some concessions had been made. When I was in Japan, I was shooting mostly outside in daylight. It is very difficult to compose off that back screen when it is lit by the sun. It's just really hard to see things. But as I started using this camera, and especially when we got indoors and I started to see what it could do, I realized that I don't think this replaces the S5 II in any way, shape, or form. I think this is a really nice small travel version of the S5 II. And so I'm going to talk about this in a second, but I think your expectations with this camera have to align with what it's going to give you. Otherwise, it is a frustrating experience. And we'll come back to that in just a second, but let's take a look at video. So again, the same sensor as the S5 II, so we're going to get a lot of those same features. Phase detection, autofocus, full frame sensor, has the ability to record 10-bit video, even open gate at 6K. This is actually something that's very well executed for the form factor, but again, because it's small, there's no fan in the body, we do have a few downsides. The biggest one is probably going to be the video recording limits. And so this means that depending on what your resolution is set at, you're only going to be able to record in short bursts. And so at 4K, that's going to be 15 minutes. At 6K, it's going to be 10 minutes. Now, that's just the length of the clip, so you can continue to record another clip. You might have some overheating issues. I haven't had any personally. Doesn't mean you won't, because that is the reason there is a recording limit on there, is because of heat dispersion. There is no fan in this camera, so it will get a little warmer. So if you want to get this camera to record your kid's school play that's going to last an hour, you're pretty much going to be out of luck unless you do something like use the HDMI output and use an external recorder. But internal recording does have limitations. Now, I mentioned that Panasonic are targeting at this at content creators that are going to be doing more in the moment things, that they're going to transfer video to their mobile device and continue to edit there. So we're talking about a use case scenario where you're probably going to be working with smaller clips, shorter clips. And one thing that's really cool, because the mobile transfer is going to be a thing, we have the 5 gigahertz transfer speed, and there also is a new video format in here. It's called MP4 Lite. And so this is going to give you the option of recording full open gate video at 10-bit at 3.8K. And so the idea is that it's a slightly lower resolution, but if you're creating video for social media, you're going to be delivering at probably 1080p. So the ability to record 3.8K aka open gate, is that you can actually crop. And one thing that's really nice about open gate recording, that basically means you're using the entire sensor. So it's a much bigger aspect ratio than you're going to get with a standard 16:9. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, what's really cool is you can, in post-production, record one set of content clips and use them all and just change the aspect ratio. You don't have to film everything two different ways. So I can go with a vertical orientation, I can go with a horizontal orientation. It doesn't matter because you've got this open gate field that you're working with and you can crop and move around within that. So that adds to a lot of flexibility. And I think in that aspect, 3.8K is probably just right. It's going to increase the transfer speed, so you're going to be able to record pretty high resolution video and get it over to your mobile device and be able to create content that's perfectly acceptable for social media. Now, Panasonic also introduced two new lenses with the release of this camera. They are very compact. We've got a prime lens. There's going to be a zoom lens, which is an 18 to 40 millimeter that's very compact. That'll be coming later this year. But I did have a chance to use this lens, which is the 26 millimeter f8. You got that right. It is an f8 lens. Essentially, the compromises were made to make a very small pancake lens that essentially is a lens cap you can just leave on the camera and shoot with. Now, I did use the lens, and there are some concessions here as well. It is a manual focus only lens. Now, the other interesting thing is there are electrical contacts on the lens, and they do communicate with the camera in terms of telling it what lens is being used. But if you use the feature on here where you're in manual focus, which you don't have a choice with this lens, everything's going to be manual focus. Typically, when you go into manual focus and you move the lens collar, you can get the picture-in-picture lens display come up where it's zoomed in the middle, and you can kind of use that for critical focus. Well, for whatever reason, this lens doesn't actually trip that, which is kind of a downside, but it is a cool lens to use just for general use if you want to have something that you can literally cram in your bag. It doesn't take up any space. It's super light. It's super easy to use. It's basically the same focal length as your default on your mobile device, on your iPhone, on your Android phone, 26 millimeters. It is an f8, so you're going to essentially use zone focusing with this. Now, I did use it quite a bit. It does work with focus peaking. It works very well. It's not the greatest lens in the world. It's not even really sharp to corner. You do lose a little bit when you get into the extreme corners, but I think for what it is and what your expectations, again, are going to be with this lens, I think it works just fine in the moment where you don't care about depth of field or anything. You just want something that you can just get pictures with. Great street photography lens, and that's what you're going to get with full frame, which is what the sensor is. But as I mentioned earlier, if you don't like this focal length or this lens, the lenses are interchangeable. It's standard L mount, so you can use anything from Panasonic, Sigma, Leica. There's a bunch of different lens options that you have for this camera. I think some of the Sigma options, some of their f2 contemporary lenses come to mind that would work really well and pair nicely with this camera. So having said that, I did use a lot of the 1.8 S prime lenses that Panasonic make that I like a lot. I use the 35 millimeter, I use the 85 millimeter, I use the 100 millimeter macro. Aside from the macro, the rest are all f1.8. They're very consistent lens to lens. They're all in the same chassis. They're very lightweight. They paired really well with this too. It does cut down a little bit on the compact size, but it's still a very small camera. And as I mentioned, the image quality is on par with what I'm able to get with the S5 II. It's just the ergonomics of the camera and actually using it to get those images if you're in broad daylight. It is very difficult if you're in the sun and you're using that monitor, and that is the only choice you have with the S9. All right, so let's look at this new button on the back of the camera that says LUT on it. What is a LUT, and what is a LUT designed to do? So LUT is an acronym. It stands for lookup table. So a color lookup table is something that's been used in video production for a long time. Let's say that you shoot log footage and you need a file that you can use where it's basically got all that color information so it will de-log your footage and get you something that you can grade in post-production. So this has been around for a long time, mainly used in video, and Panasonic have a very interesting approach with their cameras. It started actually with the S5 II. There is a way of using LUTs with that camera, and now coming over to the S9. So what they're doing is they're using lookup tables, not only for video, but also for stills, as a way of being able to grade in camera as you're shooting. So it takes the editing process out of the equation. This is actually ideal for somebody who's doing a lot of Instagram content, let's say, and you just want to be able to film and not have to do a lot of post-production. You're pretty much going to go straight up online with those. So that's the idea behind this. It works a lot like Fujifilm and the Fujifilm simulations that they use in their cameras. Now, the cool thing is that you're not just limited to the handful of color profiles that the manufacturer's baked into the firmware on the camera. In fact, the way that Panasonic are doing this is when you download the Lumix Lab app and you actually connect that with the camera, through the app, app, you can actually download LUTs, you can create LUTs, you can modify and edit LUTs, you can even combine LUTs together. So there's a lot of possibilities. In fact, it's almost infinite compared to other camera brands where all of a sudden this is opened up to what we're going to do when we edit in camera. Now, this really only applies to JPEG files and movie files. If you're shooting RAW, it won't have any impact whatsoever. You can still do those in post. So it is useful for people who want to do some color grading in the camera. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we actually had this feature on the Panasonic S9 II. It was just a little kludgy in its implementation, and I think this is a much better way of making that simple for the user to do. There's no learning curve. You just hit the button and you go. Now, many of you have probably heard me talk about my own presets ad nauseum because that's what I use for editing. It's a 2-year project where I actually went in and emulated various film stocks. All from Fujifilm, all from Kodak. They're looks that I like to use. That's how I edit my work all the time. And I've had a lot of requests when the Panasonic S9 II came out to actually port those over as LUTs so you could use them in camera. And I did experiment with that. I have not released them. And the main reason I didn't is because with the S9 II, the learning curve to be able to get them on the camera and get them imported and be able to use them was a little on the steep side. I'm considering it now with the S9, so we'll see when this comes out. I need to see how the downloadable stuff with the actual store that they're going to have on the Lumix app is going to work. But if that's something you're interested in seeing, you can drop me a comment below. But if you don't mind doing your edit and post-production and you shoot RAW files, then I'll put a link if you're interested in those as well. And it's something that I use all the time. It's going to give you the same kind of feel, but it's something you're going to do in post-production. All right, so I want to share some of my opinions on the S9 after 1 week of use. I shot with this the entire time I was in Japan. I've shot with it since I've come home. And trying to get my head around who this camera is for. I mean, clearly Panasonic have designed this for content creators, people who want to film in the moment, not necessarily on their phone. They want to use a proper camera with a full frame sensor and be able to transfer those files to their phone, be able to share those on social media. And while I do those things, I'm kind of more old school. I like to edit my video in a video editor. I like to edit my photos in Lightroom. I like to store my RAWs in my catalog. And so I have a very different workflow. And I will admit that this camera was a little bit frustrating when I first started using it. Now, having said that, I realized that little things like for still photography, the lack of a viewfinder, the lack of a mechanical shutter, those are things that I tend to kind of rely on and I need a proper camera for. However, after using this for a little while, I realized that your expectations need to line up with what the camera is going to deliver. Having said that, I do think that this is a really cool travel camera. And as long as you don't need the electronic viewfinder necessarily, or you don't care if there's a mechanical shutter or not, you just want something that's going to be portable that you can get some shots with. It's not serious work. This is actually a really nice camera. I think for video work, I would actually use this. It makes an excellent vlogging camera. If you're going to be filming yourself, you have incredible image stabilization in here. I can shoot up to 6K open gate, and if I'm vlogging, I'm going to be doing shorter clips anyway. In fact, I started thinking about it, and there was a point in my career when I first started this YouTube channel where I did more vlogging and I was creating a lot of content on the go. And this is exactly the same type of camera that I would use. Back then, it was Sony cameras. I even used Panasonic cameras, point and shoots. I even used the GX850, if any of you remember that, which was a very similar camera to this, except it was micro four thirds. This is a full frame camera and it offers a lot if those are your expectations, and I think that's something that's kind of interesting. I would not recommend this, however, if you are primarily a stills photographer and this is going to be your main camera. It just doesn't have enough features on there to do serious work on, and I would say the same for video. So while I think it's a great extension to the lineup, I think it's a really cool extension, particularly if you have the S9 or the S9 II, this makes a lot of sense. If it's going to be your main camera, it's just got a lot of limitations on it, and I think that's going to be a big deal for some. If you're a content creator and this is the kind of thing you want, I think the LUT implementation is really well done in here. I think you have a lot of options in terms of color, grading in camera with what you can do with stills and video as well. And so for somebody like that, the menus might be a little complex, but the camera operation just on the surface, especially with the LUT button, is going to be very easy to use, and I think you're probably going to find this pretty enjoyable. And of course, there's the lingering issue of the price point. So the S9 comes in at US $1,500 or so, which I think is high, but considering you're getting one of the best image stabilization systems on any camera, you're going to get face detection autofocus. It's a full frame sensor. You get a lot with that. And the other thing too is that Panasonic regularly discounts their cameras. So if you're able to be patient with this, you're probably going to be able to get this on sale at a much lower price, which totally makes sense. And if this camera's not for you, for a couple $100 more, you can get the S9 II. That makes a lot of sense. So there are a lot of options here. But of course, I would love to know what you think as well. So please drop me a comment below. And until the next video, I'll see you guys then. Later.